All right. Welcome, everybody. This is Mark Maloy, the Emerging Revolutionary War, coming live to you all. I'm actually on a beach vacation with the family out in Chincoteague Island, but glad to be coming live to you tonight. And tonight we are talking about the Battle of Princeton. And we are bringing with you live one of the historic interpreters there at Princeton State Battlefield Park, Will Krakower. We'll get him to introduce himself to you all in just a second. Those of you interested in this topic tonight, if you would like to actually come and see the actual Princeton Battlefield Park, we are doing a bus tour in November 12th to 14th, where we'll be traversing all the 10 crucial day sites from Washington's Crossing down to Trenton and eventually up to Princeton. We only have 6 seats left. So if you are interested, better get off the fence now and get your ticket as soon as possible. But we're really pleased to be joined by Will Krakower. So Will, why don't you give us a little background just on yourself and how you ended up working at Princeton Battlefield Park?
Sure. Hello. Thank you for joining us. My name is Will Krakower. I started with the State Park Service back in 2015. I was a seasonal employee over at Washington Crossing State Park. So I started my career at the State Park Service at the beginning of the 10 crucial days. And in 2018, the full-time historian at Princeton Battlefield, John Mills, who was there for an awfully long time, some of you tuning in probably know that name very well, he retired, and I was relocated to Princeton Battlefield to fill in for him when he left. And I've been there ever since. We run the Clark House State Historic Site and Museum, which the hours we'll give to you at some point during the evening, and manage the battlefield itself there.
That's great. Yeah, no. The Battle of Princeton is kind of the culmination of the 10 crucial days of the Revolution, the Trenton-Princeton campaign in September or in 1776 and 1777. But could you give us a little background? I guess you mentioned the Clark House, the actual battle. I think most people, when they think of Princeton, they probably think of the college there,
Sure.
or can you give us just a brief understanding of the geography, where you guys are at in relation to the college, and then
Sure.
and some of the background on who the Clarks were and what they were doing there?
Absolutely. So the Battle of Princeton itself covers more than 1.5 miles of ground. The entire operation, the first few phases of the battle take place on the site where Princeton Battlefield State Park is today. And we usually affiliate that, we call it the Clark Farms. The land on which the battle was fought belonged to 2 brothers, Thomas Clark and his older brother, William Clark. And it's between their 2 farmsteads that the battle ended up taking place, between the 2 hills on which they lived. But the battle itself stretches out towards town. Washington's target, as we're going to find out, the target of this operation is not the Clark Farms. This is an accident, a meeting engagement that ends up becoming one of Washington's finest victories, and also one of the British triumphant last stands of the war. They'll come back and circle around to the Battle of Princeton, probably in not the way that most of you think they will. But as the fighting moves on towards town, Washington's true target is to quickly capture the garrison. And as we'll find out when we go in later, the size of Washington's force here at Princeton allows him to focus on essentially 2 wings of the battlefield at once, sending Major General John Sullivan to clean up in town, the fighting concluding literally behind Nassau Hall, which was the center at the time of the College of New Jersey, of course today Princeton University. But on our end of the battlefield, it isn't Princeton in 1777. Princeton is where the college is, where Morven, the home of Richard Stockton, is. The area in which the battlefield park encompasses today is the Quaker settlement of Stony Brook. The Clarks are one of a few founding families of Quakers in that region. They've been there since the late 1690s, 1680s. And at this point, you're looking at the 3rd generation of Clarks in that area. Thomas and William are two of 7 Clark siblings who are living on that land. Now, William Clark's home no longer exists, but Thomas Clark's house will remain standing, and you can still come and visit us today, and we hope you do. Because of its use in the aftermath of the battle, it's used as a field hospital, as was many of the other buildings around the Clark farms, including William Clark's house, the Quaker meeting house. But our distinction comes from our most famous patient in the aftermath of the battle. And of course, that's Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, who we're going to talk an awful lot about tonight, I imagine. He will spend the last few days of his life convalescing there in the house until his passing on the morning of the 12th of January.
Okay, yeah, now. So you described a little bit about that. I guess let's get folks up to Princeton. So,
Yeah.
And I feel like Princeton often gets kind of short end because everybody remembers the crossing of the Delaware. They know that image. Maybe they've heard of Trenton, but Princeton is kind of going to be this really important part of the story, but it's right at the end of the story. So, so Washington crosses the Delaware, he attacks the Hessians, wins the victory on December 26, 1776. He gets their way back across. He comes back, and then on January 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis is going to come down and try and crush Washington's army on the south end of the Assunpink Creek. So how does Washington end up making his way even towards Princeton? I guess give us a little sense of what's going on January 2nd, 1777.
Sure. I actually think it's worth, backtracking even a little before that, because Washington, he's fortifying the southern end of the Assunpink Creek, and he's, making no attempt to hide the fact that he's there, that he's digging in. Those of you who are familiar with the campaign are aware he sends first General de Famoy's troops forward to fortify the different creek crossings on the main road between Princeton and Trenton, the King's Highway, it was called, or the Post Road. Most of you will know it as Route 206. So Washington has in his mind, I think, a game plan, and he's, actively looking for ways that this campaign is going to end. I don't think that it ever crossed his mind that it was going to end there on the bank of the Assunpink Creek. I think Washington was looking for a way to get north, to get himself between, the British Army and New York City, which is, forever his ultimate goal is to get back to New York. So even before the 2nd, it's likely that Washington had designs on Morristown, that Morristown was going to be the place that he was going to finish off this campaign. But as we approach the 2nd, more and more information is starting to come into the Continental Army camp. And Washington learns a few crucial details, and that is, one, that while the majority of the British force is being garrisoned in Princeton, soon to be coming down and fighting the Second Battle of Trenton, the garrison in New Brunswick is only lightly defended. New Brunswick was a well-known supply depot for the British Army, and a rumor trickles its way into camp. In New Brunswick, there's a chest with 70,000 pounds sterling silver being kept in it, British war chest. Now, if Washington could capture that, that would be a considerable boon to the Continental Army and a major detriment to the British cause in North America. So whether it's known that Washington was aware of that before the Battle of Princeton or after the Battle of Princeton is up to some debate. We know the first time he mentions it, at least on paper, is in a letter on January 5th to the President of the Congress, John Hancock. But that's just probably percolating in his mind. So by the evening of the 2nd, as the British are approaching down 206, Famoy will be relieved of command. He returns to Trenton drunk, and so Colonel Edward Hand takes command of the delaying action on 206. By the time they reach Trenton, and the Second Battle of Trenton has reached its conclusion, Washington is ready for his final council of war. And one of the fun anecdotes that comes out of this before the Council of War is that Brigadier General Arthur Sinclair is pulled aside by Washington prior to this Council of War, and the general, not so subtly says, "Hey, what would you think about if we, removed ourselves from this position and attacked the British rear guard at Princeton and moved on to New Brunswick and captured the supply depot there?" And of course, when the general says, "Why don't you make a suggestion?" you don't say no. And in the Council of War that follows, wouldn't you know, Brigadier General Arthur Sinclair proposes a concept wherein the Continental Army leaves a skeleton crew behind and marches around the British position to attack them in the rear at Princeton, with the intention of moving on to New Brunswick and capturing whatever supplies or war chests may or may not be there before moving on to Morristown. Now, what makes this story all the more bittersweet is that somewhere along the lines, it was added that Brigadier General Hugh Mercer is immediately slams his hand on the table and seconds Sinclair's concept, Sinclair's plan to attack Princeton. Of course, this is maybe true, maybe not true, but it does make the story to follow all the more bittersweet, as that Hugh Mercer, one of Washington's oldest friends and companions from the French and Indian War, a man who is destined to be mortally wounded in the next 24 hours, was one of the great supporters of this plan. And with this in mind, Washington and his staff decide that, yeah, we're going to head up to Princeton.
Now, there was a map of Princeton that was provided to Washington at some point?
The Cadwallader spy map. Yeah, that comes in a few days prior. And it is allegedly drawn by a student of the College of New Jersey. It has in pretty ornate detail all of the redoubts, all of the British defended positions, who's guarding it, how many troops are stationed in Princeton. Now, of course, that information is a few days old by the time it reaches Washington's lap, so it's not exactly 100% accurate, but the piece of information that's going to become the most crucial part of this plan is the existence of an unguarded back road that cuts through the Quaker property. And I think this is, a good point to talk about Quakers and their place during this war. And there's a reason why Washington and the Continental Army don't just withdraw to the south when they realize that the position along the creek may not survive a full-on attack on the morning of the 3rd. They could have gone south, but South Jersey is staunchly Quaker territory, and Washington and other subordinate officers felt that if they marched in that direction, they would not receive any assistance from the population. And this isn't because the Quakers were opposed to the patriot cause. This is because, by and large, Quakers in the 18th century wanted to stick to a neutral stance. And that may be why on the map that Washington receives, the Cadwallader spy map, the Quaker road is unguarded. British equally don't really want to have anything to do with the Quakers because they're not going to receive any assistance from them either. With this information, the plan is devised. Washington now has a route towards Princeton that is unguarded, and just like he did on the morning of the 26th when he attacked a garrison at Trenton, he feels he can approach entirely undetected.
Wow, yeah. No, I think that's fascinating to also think of how difficult it must have been for Quakers to try and maintain a neutrality in the midst of such bitter divide and constant warfare, especially in New Jersey.
Sure, and we'll find out, pretty soon. The British have been occupying Princeton and Stony Brook for the last, month, more than a month now. So, and it's not as if they've just left the Quakers alone. We know, William Clark's house, the brother of Thomas, had, at one point at least, British soldiers quartering in their building, by force. They didn't ask them. They said, hey, we're going to stay here. Their livestock was butchered. Their fences were ripped up to use for firewood. Their experience in, occupied New Jersey is not great. They can try to be as neutral as they want, but the war is coming to them one way or the other.
Yeah, no, really kind of caught in awful position. So yeah, Washington has this Council of War, makes this decision, which is awesome that the Douglas House still exists.
Yes.
One of the stops on our route, not in the same location.
No. Well, you'll find that's the case with a lot of buildings and sites here. Rockingham, which is not related to this campaign, but is Washington's final headquarters when one of our fellow state park sites was moved twice in its lifetime and no longer sits where it originally sat. So it's not entirely uncommon.
Not going to complain because it still exists. It could have been destroyed,
right.
I guess.
Right.
It's nice that it still exists, but yeah, not in the same location. But But so yeah, so he has this dramatic council of war. They make this. It's a bold decision, right, to try and march an entire disengage and march around the flank of a superior force. Must have been, I always consider this one of the boldest moves Washington makes in the war, because at any point, if he meets resistance or something, it's the middle of the night. His corps could be cut to pieces. So.
Yeah, this is definitely a gamble in every sense of the word. Washington's force at this moment, before he even disengages off the bank of the creek, is about 6,000 or 7,000 men. Now, between Trenton and Princeton, he's going to lose 1,000 men in the dark, and they'll withdraw to the south, not knowing what happens. And he's waking up different portions of the army at different times of the night. And as we'll see, it's the same thing that we see during the crossing operation. Very few people knew the destination. They just had their orders to wake their troops up and follow the guys in front of them, and to do so under absolute silence. Of course, as we know, they can't do it in absolute silence. Trying to move 6,000 men is not going to be a quiet operation. And one of the parts of this story that I enjoy is that across on the other side of the creek, the north side, the British Army, some 8,000 men, not camped too far away from the bank of the river, are actively on picket. They're on patrol. They're listening, and reports keep coming back to Cornwallis's headquarters. I think something's happening out there. There's definitely troops moving out there, and yet, for one reason or another, they never make it, to Cornwallis's ear. It never comes. It's always pushed aside, pushed aside. That's another one of those anecdotes that I like so much, those fun quotes where the night before Washington's having his council of war, Cornwallis is, of course, having one of his own, and he's determined to attack Washington on the morning of the 3rd. He's going to flank around the creek and destroy Washington's army wholesale. And one of his subordinate generals comes up to him and says, "Sir, if you trust those people to be there tomorrow morning, they'll be gone." And Cornwallis waves him off and says, "We'll bag them in the morning." And that one I always liked. Cornwallis duped again, time after time after time. And this is a competent commander, as we're going to find out later in the campaign. But he just, for one reason or another, he always trusted Washington to be there, and Washington always disappointed him.
Yeah, we'll bag him in the morning. I mean, that's a great quote for what actually happens. And another thing that's amazing about this moment in history, I think, is as the British are coming down on the 2nd, not only are they fighting Hansmen, they're fighting the weather, because it warmed up so that the roads had turned to muck, and they're all like slogging down in this mud, and you can imagine Washington trying to do this midnight maneuver through mud, which would have been difficult. But of course, the temperature plummets and it gets so cold that those roads freeze over. So it's meant to actually maneuver.
Yeah, like pavement. Yeah, that's what we have quotes from the officers who wrote it, who described the mud caked, frozen mud caked roads as if they were hard as pavements. So the weather is always looking out for General Washington. It always seems to go his way, and that army slips away, not undetected, but untouched. And they slip away in the middle of the night, and Washington does the classic Washington maneuver. He leaves a skeleton crew of militia behind to burn bonfires and bang around pots and pans and make Cornwallis think he's still over there, which, when morning comes, Cornwallis is going to be sorely disappointed.
Yeah, so they march through the night. Now, was his original plan, was it similar to Trenton, where he was hoping to get on top of the British even before morning rose? Or
yeah, so when we see Washington approaching Princeton, he's about 3.5 miles away as the sun is just beginning to come up, nautical twilight. The light is just starting to creep up. And at this point, he knows he's probably not going to make it to town before the sun comes up, which, isn't new for this campaign. Washington had to make the same call 10 days earlier for Trenton. So when he reaches the southern portion of the Stony Brook, which borders the park today in a large L shape, with the DNR Canal today running adjacent to it that wasn't there at the time. He reaches that bridge to the south and realizes that this bridge is not going to be able to carry his artillery over it because this is, of course, a Quaker bridge, hence the name Quaker Bridge Road today. This is just a small bridge that was meant for families traveling from this region of Stony Brook down to the Chesterfield Friends meeting. So his troops have to reinforce this bridge, and just dawn, just now squeaking out. And at this time, he pulls his troops over to the side of the road and has his council of war. And it's a remarkably similar plan to what we see in Trenton. He divides his army into, instead of 2, now 3 columns. He's going to surround the town from multiple directions, cut off access to the bridge on 206 on the King's Highway, and hopefully capture the garrison without much fuss. Because, of course, now time is of the essence. With literally minutes until dawn, it's only a matter of time before Cornwallis wakes up and realizes that Washington's no longer on the southern bank of the creek. So Washington is racing the clock. He has to attack, defeat the garrison in Princeton, march to New Brunswick, and attack and defeat that garrison as well, all while Cornwallis's force is coming up behind him. So now he's truly on the clock. So he's hoping for a swift capture of the town, same as Trenton.
Yeah, and so once they get this bridge constructed and they're able to start heading forward, like you say, he's going to divide his force there, and part of it's supposed to go off and cut off that Cornwallis attempt to come up, right?
Yeah, so he actually sends, here's another fun anecdote I like, is the German regiment under the command of Colonel Nicholas Hausiger. And Hausiger's regiment is sent off immediately. They're one of the first units running off towards the bridge, and their job is to scout the location north of town near the Hudibras Tavern. And they march off before Washington's even concocted his plan and disappear. And we'll circle back to them later, because they simply somehow they managed to cross that bridge unnoticed from the enemy, which we'll get to, and they don't partake in the battle. They're somewhere north of town for the duration of the fight. Some 300 men simply gone. But the follow-up to that is one of the 3 columns, which I guess we should break down the columns. The column tasked with the capture and destruction of what is today the Stony Brook Bridge near Words Mill at the intersection of Quaker Bridge Road and Route 206 is Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin's brigade. He's accompanied by De Famoy's brigade as well. They're going to march north along the Quaker Bridge Road, capture whatever troops are guarding that bridge, and then destroy it. That is their order. They are to destroy that bridge, post a guard, and then continue marching north to Princeton. The other 2 columns are going to follow a different path. The first is under the command of General John Sullivan. Sullivan's column is Washington's strike force. If we look at the troops that are placed under Sullivan's command for this particular engagement, it is almost all of his veteran troops. These are the guys who have been around since New York, some of them even since Boston. These are his hardened, regular Continental Army troops. There are very few militia units in Sullivan's column. He's going to march up a side road, that back road we were talking about, the unguarded road. It has many names in its lifetime. We call it the Trace Road, we call it the Sawmill Road, but it was a small, little used, even by this point, back road that was built by the Quakers to get their animals and their equipment from one end of 1,200 acres of farmland to the other without actually running over the farmland. And Washington is going to use it as his southern approach to Princeton. The second column, or rather I should say the third column, is the one given to Brigadier General Hugh Mercer. And at this point, Mercer is given, essentially breveted to divisional command, and he has control of his brigade, Lord Stirling's brigade, which isn't much of a brigade. There's fewer than 50 men in it at this point. and what was at the time the largest single brigade in the Continental Army. It's the Philadelphia Associators, about 1,100 or 1,300 men, depending on the account you read, under the command of Colonel John Cadwalader, militia organization from Philadelphia. And Mercer's column is to march following that same back road and then take the middle road to Princeton. And we do this because we're not really sure what that means. And it only appears in one account that we're aware of, but we're not sure what they could have meant by that middle road. It's possible that it was just a misunderstanding and that they were to follow the same back road that Sullivan was. It's possible that there was another small road. These are farm lanes that sort of spiderweb their way across, hundreds of acres of farm from Stony Brook all the way into Princeton. It's possible that there was another one, or it could simply have just been a miscommunication, which, it's the fog of war, it happens. Suffice it to say, Mercer is following Sullivan's column up the Sawmill Road, which is how he's going to end up parallel to the Clark House at around 8 o'clock in the morning when things kick off.
Yeah. So Sullivan's guys, they're going up this back road. They go past the Thomas Clark House, and they're going up, and then they look over, and what do they see?
So this is where things start to get messy. The brigade that's been left in town, the 4th Brigade of the British Army, is under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood, or Maud. And Mahood's command is simply tasked with the protection of Princeton and that garrison until around the time Washington is sneaking away from Trenton. He receives orders from Cornwallis to bring the baggage train south from Princeton to Trenton to join in what Cornwallis was hoping was going to be the final battle of the war. And so at the same time that Washington's men are shoring up that bridge and splintering their way towards Princeton, Mahood steps off from Princeton, marching down the main road, 206, towards the Stony Brook Bridge that Washington's troops are heading for. Mahood has with him not his entire brigade. He leaves behind the 40th Regiment of Foot to guard the garrison. Of course, he's expecting not to find anybody, so of course a single regiment should have been more than enough. He takes with him his own regiment, the 17th Regiment of Foot, his premier regiment, and the 55th Regiment of Foot. He's also joined by 2 companies of the 16th Light Dragoons, and what I like to call a battalion of convalescents. There's a handful of other companies of light infantry and grenadiers and misfits whose parent regiments are all down in Trenton. And for one reason or another, these companies were left behind, or these men were on sick leave or on some other business and were marching south to Trenton with Mahood. What ends up happening is Mahood will reach the high ground on the far side of the Stony Brook Bridge well before Mifflin's column is even within view. What that gives him is essentially a bird's eye view of about 5 miles in every direction. As a result, from the top of that hill, the vanguard of Mahood's column looks back towards the rising sun, towards the Clark farms, and sees a body of troops moving towards Princeton. From that distance, they couldn't really tell who it was. And at the same time, either the rear of Sullivan's column or the vanguard of Mercer's column spots the 16th Dragoons on the top of Cochrane's Hill, and this mutual sighting causes both columns to halt. And so from about 7:50 to almost 8 o'clock in the morning, there's no movement because both forces are very confused at the presence of the other. Mahood acts quickly. He sends down some scouts from the 16th Dragoons. Lieutenant Simon Wilmot ends up coming within rifle range of Mercer's men, who do them the honor of giving them a quick whip of rifle shot. They will ride back and inform Colonel Mahood that these are not Hessians. This is not a small portion of Washington's army running from their lives from Trenton. No, this is a sizable portion of the Continental Army, and there's probably more back there. Interestingly, Mahood isn't convinced, even after hearing the rifle fire, and sends Wilmot down a second time. And by the time Wilmot confirms this and rides back, Mahood is already sending his troops back towards town. On the other side of the field, Washington realizes that the plan is now in danger of falling apart. The Continental Army was going to operate for the next 10 minutes under the assumption that the troops they saw on the top of Cochrane's Hill are nothing more than a scouting party, that the garrison is still very much back in town. And so Washington orders Mercer, who's conveniently now located right on the Clark Farms, to commit a reconnaissance in force and to stop that scouting party from getting back and warning the garrison in town that the Americans are on the approach. And so we have, in a matter of moments, both armies rushing to secure the same piece of high ground to conduct both of their operations. For the Americans, it's to find out what's over here, who are they, how much have they seen. For Mawhood, it's a totally different story. He now has an incredibly difficult decision to make. He knows, even if he's unaware of the full strength of Washington's force, that his battalion that he has with him is fewer than 800 men. You know, some accounts say it's fewer than 500 men. So he's badly outnumbered from the get-go. And the fact that, you know, this 46-year-old, 24-year veteran of the British Army makes the decision to advance on a superior numbered force and bring the fight to them shows you the mettle of the kind of men the Continental Army were facing off against during the American Revolution. Mawhood chooses an apple orchard sitting on the top of a large hill with 206 to his rear. He feels it's an excellent way to defend the bridge from any Patriot attack. Mercer chooses the apple orchard because it overlooks the road, and he's hoping to stop any British troops from getting back to town. And at about 8:05, 8:10 in the morning, they come up over the hill nearly simultaneously in William Clark's apple orchard, and the battle begins.
Yeah, like you said before, it's a meeting engagement. Neither side really planned it to happen this way, but the two columns kind of converge there. And yeah, so you have Mercer's brigade going up there up against these I mean, it's pretty amazing that Mawhood's going to go with such a small force up against this. But you have to imagine, British regulars, this is what they're trained and been preparing for the whole time. So here they are actually engaging. And and you're right. And they're going to start off in the orchard there. And now some brutal fighting that's going to happen that morning.
This is some of the fiercest fighting of the war. It's at close range, less than 50 yards altogether. The British advance first with a picket line, withdraw, and return to the orchard in force. It's few volleys before things really start to pick off. The Americans fire, the British fire back, and at this point, Mawhood realizes he needs to control the hill, will order his men to fix bayonets, and charges into the apple orchards to kick Mercer's brigade off of that hill. This is not a small, it's not a skirmish. By this point, only a few volleys in, you have artillery also being fired on both sides. Captain Daniel Neal's East Jersey Artillery Battery with Mercer's brigade and a Royal Artillery Battery with Mawhood. This is exceptionally close range for this kind of fighting. The casualties are starting to mount up, and the fighting hasn't been going on for more than 10 minutes.
Yeah, and and especially I think the officers that start going down too is it demonstrates the fierceness of the fighting that's going on there.
Right, and we see it on both sides. There's an excellent account from the British where one of the few surviving officers of the 17th Regiment of Foot thought, in the first few moments that they were going to withdraw, because he looked around, he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and almost every line officer had been shot, either killed or wounded. He was one of the few left standing, and he had been struck in the chest already with a ball, but it didn't break skin. On the other end, the bayonet charge through the apple orchard picks off almost the entirety of Mercer's brigade command. Mercer himself is, of course, this is the famous moment, right? If you slid your head that way, you'd see there he is there, his final moments. This is the famous Trumbull painting. Mercer is dehorsed. His horse is shot out from underneath him. He finds himself surrounded, and he is ordered to surrender. One of the accounts remembers somebody saying, "Draw quarter, you damned rebel," or surrender. And Mercer responds by saying, "I am no rebel," and tries to fight his way free. For his troubles, he's received 7 bayonet wounds to the abdomen and a blow to the head from the butt of a musket. Another interpretation that we hear is that the British soldiers, with their dander riled up and their blood boiling, thought that Mercer, who was wearing an officer's uniform, was George Washington, and bayoneted him ruthlessly because they thought he was their commanding officer. I'm personally partial to the first story, but both are entirely possible. His second in command, Colonel John Hazlitt, is shot through the head and killed instantly, trying to reestablish command, and the bayonet charge does exactly what British bayonet charges at this point of the war did. It routed Mercer from the field. His brigade goes streaming back down the hill, back towards the safety of the high ground around Thomas Clark's house, and they run straight into the next advancing unit on the field. It's Colonel Cadwallader's Philadelphia Associators. And as they march onto the field, they run straight first into Mercer's retreating men, and it creates a whole mess that Cadwallader is not able to unsituate himself from. As the British and American forces collide, it's hand-to-hand fighting, it's brutal fighting, and it ultimately forces both Cadwallader and Mercer's brigades running for cover. And one well-placed bayonet charge, it turns out, no matter how outnumbered you are, can punch a hole through the center of the American line. With very few men defending the area around Thomas Clark's house, in a matter of moments, Mawhood has turned his battle entirely upside down. We haven't even been fighting for more than a half hour.
Yeah, and I think this is such a, I mean, it shows you, even though you have the disparities in the numbers, the panic that must just stream through the men on the American side just from as the guys are running into each other. You can imagine, especially a lot of the guys in the militia who had never even fought in a battle before, and you start seeing wounded people coming streaming into your ranks talking about what they just saw in the orchard. And as you mentioned, the brutality of the bayonets. I think one of the the saddest stories in that orchard was Bartholomew Yates, who is a 18-year-old who he gets knocked down, clubbed in the head, and a British soldier stops right next to him and loads his musket and fires it right into his breast, and then they bayonet him 13 times.
Yeah.
And so you can just imagine.
Still alive. He lives another week. For the poor lieutenant, Dr.
Yeah, just absolutely brutal. And you can imagine, men streaming back and seeing that and hearing that, and then just the panic and the fear of the men starting to break and run. So you have the opportunity here, Mawhood, totally outnumbered by hitting them by surprise here, and has the potential of smashing right through Washington's line, cutting his whole army in half. And who knows what could happen if Maud's successful in doing that. What happens to the revolution at that point? There's a lot of question marks.
This is a pretty intense moment for the American Revolution. You're looking at the possibility of the Continental Army falling apart. They're strung out. The strongest section they've had has just been sent to pieces. What happens next is just some very good timing. On behalf of a lot of people really step up in those few moments, and we'll tick them off as they go. But I always like to start with Captain Joseph Mulder, who's over 60 years old. He's a commanding officer of a pair of 4-pounder French brass cannons from Cadwallader's Philadelphia Associator Brigade. And he's anchored near the center left of the American line. He's supported by very few remaining Continental Army units. Most of Mercer and Cadwallader's men have fled. With that unit was 3 battalions of Continental and Philadelphia Marines. So what they've done during the fight is still up to speculation. We don't know if they stayed or if they withdrew with the remaining forces. But there's a skeleton crew defending Mulder's battery, and instead of withdrawing, Mulder fires point blank into the advancing British troops. He fires not his solid round shot, but grape shots and case shot. He fires straight into the severe right of the British line. An officer remembered several years later, when writing about it, that the British were screaming and throwing their arms as though they had been possessed by so many devils. I like that quote. And it just shows the veracity and the speed at which Mulder was firing literally blunts the British advance, on that wing of the line. On the other side of the line, Washington, who's been listening to the catastrophe unfold behind him turn into a full-blown disaster, finally leaps into action. He'll detach Colonel Hitchcock and Colonel Hand's brigades from Sullivan's column and rushes onto the field to meet the enemy, and he'll meet them on the grounds today that was just recently saved by the American Battlefield Trust, sort of known as Maxwell's Field. That's the point at which a majority of that fighting is finally blunted with the arrival of Hand and Hitchcock. So the American right is sealed, the American left is at least saved, as Washington. Oh, here we go. There you go. Very good.
Sharing with you, just so when people are talk about this, just so you can see, this is the latest map from the Battlefield Trust of the fighting there, right about this time that Will's talking about. So you can see Hitchcock down here coming down. You see a 17th Regiment of Foot in the British, both on the battlefield land and then also that land that was recently acquired.
Yeah, so the map shows what's coming up next year, which is good. It's easier to describe that way. As Washington runs back towards his broken center, he's spotted by a number of people who all write about the same moment. So we're fairly certain that it did in fact occur. And this is Washington not riding behind the American line to rally his men, but in front of the American lines, riding through no man's land as British and American soldiers are firing back and forth. He is heard waving his sword, waving his hats to have said, "Parade with me, my brave fellows, for there are but a handful of the enemy, and we shall have them directly." And this is, of course, a marvelous little line. Whether or not he said it, again, like all things, we sort of have to take these sources with a grain of salt. But it does sound very George Washington-esque. And as Washington rides down the length of the line, his men are inspired. Cadwallader, who's managed to restore some order to his brigade and to Mercer's shattered brigade, points at the general and has his men rush up to reseal the line. And it's like something out of a Spielberg film. They come rushing over the hill past the Thomas Clark House, and the American line is resealed by the bravery of their commanding officer. And at this point, you're looking at about 1,500 to 2,000 American troops now bearing down on the apple orchard across the way. But this is a good moment to talk about the reserve, the steel of the British troops. Maloy is very clearly outnumbered and is rapidly approaching a point where he's going to be surrounded. And he still does not remove himself from that defensive position. And at this point, we can chalk it up to insane bravery or the ticking clock going on in the back of his head. Every moment that Maloy is here fighting on the hill is another second that Cornwallis's reinforcements are closer, closer, and closer. The closest garrison to Princeton is actually in Maidenhead, today Lawrence Township. Maloy is probably counting the seconds until the arrival of General Leslie. But his time runs out, unfortunately, with the arrival down there on the left-hand side of the map of General Mifflin. Mifflin's column, that third column tasked with the destruction of the bridge, instead of following those orders, Mifflin follows the sound of the guns and rushes off to aid Washington on the Clark Farms. As he arrives, Maloy now finds himself tragically outnumbered, 4 or 5 to 1, surrounded on nearly 3 sides. He's been fighting off the Continental Army for the better part of now 45 minutes, going on an hour. Somewhere during this fighting, Maloy is struck with a ball in the hip. It's not a mortal wound, but it's enough, I think, to slightly shake his nerve. And it's at this moment that I think both sides realize the initiative has just changed. And Maloy orders a general withdrawal, slowly at first, but then turns into a full-blown rout as Washington leads a countercharge across the field. Some 2,500 American troops go screaming across Thomas and William Clark's farm, and Maloy's shattered brigade flees for their lives, some of them fleeing to the south towards Maidenhead, but some fleeing back to the north to the safety of the arms of the last British regiment standing, the 40th Regiment of Foot. And this is where the fight has sort of evolved on the far side of the field, part of the battle that is not included in Princeton Battlefield State Park. And this is the action, of course, on what is known today, or what is known then as Frog Hollow. Today, it's the golf course next to the graduate school. So if you're ever golfing there, know that there was a battle fought where you're struggling to finish your back nine. Sullivan's troops are rushing towards Princeton. As they do, they quickly mop up 2 companies of the 55th Regiment of Foot, which had been posted on a hill nearby. This is another fun story where I believe it's Colonel Scott, the Virginian, comes up and this is where the columns are still halted, and he sees them up there on that hill, and he turns to his men and he says, "Boys, there's 250 of them and some 250 of us. I reckon we can whip them." And off they go. Scott's brigade goes running towards the hill, and the 55th Regiment, allegedly, those few companies, flee without firing a shot. They rush back towards town, where they meet the last regiment standing, the 40th Regiment of Foot. The 40th sallies out to meet Sullivan's advance at Frog Hollow, but what follows is, nothing short of the same that occurred on the Clark farms. There are just too many American muskets on the field, and they're pushed off. They'll take cover in Nassau Hall, firing down on Sullivan's troops below. Sullivan brings forth the recently promoted Brigadier General Henry Knox to level the building to the ground. Accounts of the barrage of Nassau Hall range from a single shot fired to a full-blown barrage of the building. We know of at least one story that has a ring of truth to it, which is a cannonball went sailing through the back door and decapitated the portrait of King George II, George III's grandfather, and who had chartered the school. So naturally, it hung there. But today, if you go and take a tour of the building, it's the Charles Wilson Peel portrait of General Washington at the Battle of Princeton. Very fitting. But we know of at least one cannonball that went sailing through. That cannonball is sometimes credited to Alexander Hamilton, who, if you know your Hamilton history or have seen the musical a dozen times like I have, you know that one of his first choices for higher education when he comes here to the United States is the College of New Jersey, to which he is denied. So how many of us do get a chance to fire a cannonball through our first choice? But whether or not that story is true, again, has to be taken with a grain of salt. But however many cannonballs went sailing through Nassau Hall, the 40th Regiment of Foot waved a white flag out the window and surrendered before the building could fall. And so you still get to tour it today. As things are wrapped up, Washington and his troops move back towards town. They'll do what a starving army does, and whatever the British Army hasn't picked clean, the American troops certainly do their worst on the little town of Princeton. So much so that buildings will still be in a burnt and decayed state by the time the British finally arrive, which isn't too long after the fighting has stopped.
Now, and then also once they reconvened in the center of town, what about that chest up there at
yeah, so again, right, so Washington's on the clock, and as I said, starving armies do what starving armies do, and Washington does have some trouble reestablishing control of the Continental forces as they're going through town. The sound of gunfire is distantly heard about 2 hours after the fighting ceases at Nassau Hall, and it's the vanguard of Cornwallis's column, who woke up on the 3rd, realized Washington wasn't there and was no fool, and quickly double times his way back as the sound of the guns can be heard echoing down the river valley. As he makes it to the bridge, as it turns out, Mifflin's men didn't really do a great job destroying it, and it doesn't take long for the British to piece it back together and cross. Washington is forced to withdraw through town. He does so and marches north and crosses the Millstone River at Kingston, burning that bridge behind him. Once again, Captain Mulder saves the day, fending off the British light infantry. But it's in Kingston, near where the cemetery is today, that Washington makes the fateful decision not to march to New Brunswick and instead to commit his forces entirely up the Millstone towards Morristown. And as it turns out, and will turn out, that chest was there. And so it's a massively missed opportunity for the Continental Army. But it does explain the actions of the British in the aftermath of the battle. Them rushing through town, they barely stopped to say hello. Count the dead, realize what's going on, and Cornwallis pushes his troops pell-mell back towards New Brunswick. They actually have a forced march through the night to get there by morning. They're so afraid that Washington's going to swing back around and attack the garrison. So missed opportunity.
Missed opportunity, but you got to say, I mean, Washington's lucky he's now
right.
British on the run when just 24 hours earlier it looked like
sure.
all over
yeah.
for it.
No, I always like to say when we're giving tours, all's well that ends well, right? As far as it goes, it's certainly a majorly missed opportunity. That's a Harry Turtledove level what if scenario. What if Washington captures the war chest at New Brunswick? So some historic fiction writer out there have a field day with that.
Yeah.
What's left behind because of this urgency to get out of town by both armies are fields filled with the frozen bodies of the dead and the dying, and nobody in command of the town to take care of them. And so at least in our corner of the battlefield, we have kind of an egalitarian hospital situation where you have both British and American soldiers being taken care of together under the same roof by British and American surgeons at the same time. Certainly in the Quaker homes, we see this evident in the Clark House. The following day, Dr. Benjamin Rush, a member of the Congress, a signer of the Declaration, and chief surgeon of the Continental Army, rolls into town and immediately takes over, as chief surgeon of the entire hospital operation, not just in the Clark House, but in all of the various buildings from Stony Brook all the way to Princeton to help take care of the wounded. We have at Princeton on the far side of the field, for those of you who visited, I'm sure you know, the colonnade marks the approximate location of a mass burial site, 37 British and American soldiers buried together in a mass grave, which is a rarity for the American Revolution. And this is all because this fighting occurred on and was cleaned up by the Quakers and their land. So their land, their rules, and they really didn't, distinguish between one uniform or the other. They were all equal so far as they knew. Mercer, who's still alive at the aftermath of the battle, is taken back to the Clark House with a number of other wounded soldiers from both armies. He's with us at the Clark House for 9 days. He's taken care of by Dr. Rush, and it's noted that he's nursed by Sarah Clark, Thomas's sister, and Susanna, an enslaved woman owned collectively by the Clark family. She's noted in multiple accounts as being there in the Clark House, helping not only Mercer, but even some of the British officers as well. Unfortunately, Mercer meets his maker, and he dies on the morning of the 12th. When he dies, it leaves a sizable hole in Washington's command staff. This is one of his, forward-thinking, brigade level commanders who actually had some serious military experience. This was a guy who had fought in the French and Indian War. He had experience fighting with the Scottish rebels under the Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the chief surgeon for Bonnie Prince Charlie at the Battle of Culloden. So his loss is deeply felt. Aside from that, he's also a close personal friend of George Washington's now. So, this one really hits home for Washington and the Continental Army, Mercer's loss. And he's not the only one. The total casualties by the end of this battle for the Americans will, by most accounts, come out to 40 killed and 40 wounded. I tend to think that it was probably more than that. But even if that's the case, a large number of those 40 are officers, line officers that Washington loses, competent field commanders. So this one, it's going to take us a while to bounce back from this.
Yeah, no, and and you talk about those numbers of casualties, and I feel like some people, I know when they were fighting for the preservation of portion of the battlefield, somebody was saying in some op-ed like, oh well, that's not that many people compared to a
Sure.
war battle, but you look at the descriptions of some of the deaths that these were, and it's just awfully brutal, especially with the frozen ground, talking about the blood pooling on the in the frozen pieces of ground, and just how awful. We mentioned already how Mercer and Yates were just like brutally bayoneted. But then it's the significance of it all. What was going on here? And you're right, like Mercer he's one of the highest ranking officers of the Continental Army killed in combat and becomes a martyr for the cause of American independence. And as we were talking about, it looked like, that Mahood and the British might be able to destroy Washington's army here. Washington's victory here at Princeton culminates these 10 days of intense maneuvering and combat that ultimately is going to shift the tide of the American Revolution from one of complete and utter failure to actually having a chance of victory. So
Sure.
Yeah, I just
absolutely
think that significance is so important. So.
There's a great quote by a Britisher living in Virginia at the time. Shortly after the battles of Trenton and Princeton, he writes that, and I'm sure I'm gonna misquote it here, but it's something along the lines that they were ready to give up. The Patriots were ready to give up their cause as lost, but after the late action at Trenton and Princeton, they have all gone liberty mad again. Right, and that's the sentiment that I think is the big takeaway from the 10 crucial days and these battles at Trenton and Princeton. Was the war going to be won here? Absolutely not. Could it have been lost here? 100%. And the fact that these victories occurred saves the American Revolution, in one of its darkest hours. That they've all gone liberty mad again. I love that one. It sort of reminded everybody, what we were in this for.
That quote comes from Virginia loyalist who was watching. I mean, it shows you the breadth of this too. That it wasn't just in New Jersey. This is across the entire country. People,
right.
This is the end of the whole cause, and here was this opportunity. Yeah. And I think it's so significant too, just in the personage of George Washington. I think we think of Washington crossing the Delaware and his heroic moment. This moment at Princeton was his moment. I think him riding up in between the lines. George Washington's adopted grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, actually writes about Washington being told by John Fitzgerald, who was one of his aides, how he rode up in between the lines and both sides fired, and he covered his hat.
It covers his face.
Cut down right in front of him, and lifts his hat, and the smoke clears, and there's Washington unscathed. And it's kind of like this legend of who Washington was really born in this moment.
Yeah, I think in David Hackett Fisher's book, The Washington's Crossing, he makes an excellent point. And I agree completely that the 10 crucial days is the metamorphosis of Washington, the man to Washington, the legend. This is a man who's respected by his troops, in some ways, and certainly being vilified by other officers, within the Continental Army, and people in the Congress don't like him. But from December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, the man transcends, and the myth of George Washington, the stoic commander, the quick thinking commander, the man who leads from the front, is born. There's a lot to say about that. There's a lot to break down about the myth and the man. But this is, I agree, this is where his troops, especially, will come to grow, undeniably devoted to their commanding officer.
No, it's just it's a great moment. But so we're running up at the top of the hour here. I want you. Can you tell people when they can, how they can come visit the Princeton Battlefield Park, what they can see?
Absolutely. So we're back running at a pseudo regular schedule. We're asking that for those of you who are interested in visiting the Clark House, we're open Wednesday through Sunday, but Wednesday through Friday, we're asking you to call ahead. We're doing by appointment tours only, but Saturdays we are open from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., 1 p.m. to 4 p.m., and Sundays we're open from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Come give us a visit. Regular visits to the house include a tour of the Clark House and the museum attached, as well as in some instances we have special events and occasions where we'll do a full-fledged battlefield tour, which is very enjoyable. Is fun to listen to us talk about it, but there's nothing quite like visiting the ground itself, and getting to stand where Washington and the Continental Army fought for independence.
Yeah, no, and that's something. Yeah, being the power of place, being in the spot where these people did amazing things. If anybody is interested and you want to come in November, like I said, we have our bus tour, Victory or Death. It'll be November 12th through 14th. We'll be on the 14th. We'll be up there at Princeton Battlefield Park. Like I said, only 6 tickets left, so buy your tickets if you want a chance to come check it out. I know we're all looking forward to being up there, being on that special ground. But I really want to thank Will for joining us. Just a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for sharing that with everybody.
My pleasure.
And yeah, we look forward to having you on again.
All right. Well, we'll see you.